This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This is our third part in our three-part series on stewardship in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. And we previously had videos talking about hospitality and gratitude, and this week we concluded talking about abundance with relationship to stewardship. So first is to understand, because Paul talks about abundance. And those who reap sparingly, or sow sparingly, reap sparingly. That there is this language of abundance. And there is a tension in the Bible of talking about abundance and sufficiency. And there are portions of the Bible that really seem to talk about sufficiency and not abundance. Think about manna and quail in the wilderness, wherein what they have is what you need to live on, but it is not abundance. The Bible does not support anything like a prosperity gospel, as if to say, if you are right with God, then you're going to theologically prosper. I will grant that in the Deuteronomistic history, Joshua through the end of 2 Kings, there's something sort of like that, but the whole point is that that wasn't working. It ends with the fall of the kingdoms. And so instead, we have more usually a focus on sufficiency. But Paul here and elsewhere in the New Testament does talk about abundance. However, if we look carefully at what Paul is saying, it frames it in a very interesting way. Because his focus is on sharing abundantly. And his focus is, so it's an action of how to share, but that what one has is enough, which is a whole lot more like sufficiency. And so abundance is absolutely there, but it is from how one shares. In chapter 8, in the last video, we talked about generosity from your abundance to their need, from their abundance to your need. Paul does not seem to have a monothetic focus on abundance. That would be prosperity theology, as if to say, if you follow God, everything is going to go well. No, it is instead a specific abundance. You have some abundances where others have needs. They have abundances where you have needs. Neither of you are either prospering or languishing. It's more complicated than that. And his point before about equality, that there being enough for everyone, the focus really is on having enough. And yet, how do we have an attitude of abundance? And this seems to be the focus. How do you live in a spirit of generosity, which then has a focus on sharing from abundance and having enough for yourselves? These things are kind of in tension, backward and forward, but it is instead an activity. How do I share? How do I have enough? Well, there's a variety of things going on, but Paul in 2 Corinthians 9 uses an agricultural metaphor that from seed and growth, and that was the one who sows sparingly reaps sparingly, and that if you plant seed, there is growth. That is a real thing that happens. And there's a few aspects of that. One is it does lead to something kind of like abundance, where, well, if I plant seed and it grows, if I had one seed before, obviously you have huge abundance by comparison. But there's a few things that I think Paul is intending about this. This isn't seed faith. That's here in prosperity theology. Instead, I think it has to do with that there is something unique about this agricultural model, that it can grow and produce more of itself without you losing the seed you originally have. If you had one seed, you could still have one seed, leading to your ability to share what is there. It is a resource that is that doesn't, you don't lose out if another person is given it. It's different than if I buy a book and then give it to you, well, then I don't have the book anymore. Well, the agricultural aspect doesn't have that. The agricultural aspect is it grows and the growth goes outward, but I still have what is meaningful and is enough for myself. There's another aspect to that seed component, though, which is it's about the value of the seed. That there is something here that really will grow. And in this case, Paul is talking about the gospel. That this relationship you have with Christ really is something that produces. And this is, well, yes, he is talking about fiscal resources. He's talking about a whole lot more about this. As we talked about in our previous videos, it's all about relationships. And that the real value is the relationships you are able to have in Christ that you could not have had. So that you in Corinth, in support of Paul, are now in direct relationship with people you never met. And that's something that Paul thinks is as very real. It's not just a sales pitch. That you really are in relationship with all those others in Christ. And that comes from the seed you have really does something. That is, this gospel we have really does something. But there's even more going on. Because here, this tendency of from what you have is enough, your sufficiency, is able to be shared abundantly. He actually looks at this carefully, where he said, if you provide this, you will not only be supplying the need of these others' communities, but it will be your thanksgiving to God. Some people are uncomfortable with that kind of language because you don't want to, that could become manipulative if one is not careful. However, Paul is thinking here in good theology. He's trying to say, well, there's something about our relationship with God. God comes to us, we respond in thanksgiving. But that's not how we are called, this vertical thing, us and God. We live with others in the world. And when God comes to us, when we receive grace, God's gift to us, the way we say thank you to God, well, there's many ways, but many of the main ones is not just saying, verbally saying thanks to God. It is how I give thanks to God is caring for my neighbor, is working for others, so that the response I have to God is external to other people. And that is a good theological sensitivity, that giving thanksgiving to God is supplying another person's need. And I don't think Paul thinks that it only works if you're funding his particular mission. No, that's true for any time you are loving God, you are loving neighbor. What we are called to do. And further, he calls it glorifying. God. How do we recognize God is God? By caring for one another. And there's another aspect here that's very important. And it's the last aspect I want to emphasize, which is, what are we called to do? And this is the key point here. We have enough. And we are called to share abundantly with what we actually have. We are not called to share with what we don't have. Dietrich Bonhoeffer called it, we are called into our ordinary. What is it we have? With whom do we actually have relationships? That's where we're called. That's who we can support. And that this gospel will grow and will act in the ordinary spaces we live in. That is the Lutheran doctrine of vocation. And I believe there's previous theology videos on vocation. But the way we serve God is once again how we serve others. That is how we respond to the grace of God that has come to us, that overflows and can't help but go outwardly to other people. That is a spirit of generosity. It is a theology of sufficiency. It is a theology of sharing abundantly. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.